and so and here's Lee. Hello. The very busy Miss Lee.
I was just probably the same as
Hello, everybody. You should say hello to him, yeah?
No, I've been over it every year or something.
How I thanks for the video, by the way.
Oh, no worries.
It's really helpful. He's doing a big talk.
Yeah, so I was saying it's not an EAL initiative, it's a whole school program, which I happened to come across about 4 or 5 years ago, and it took me 2 years to convince this lot that it's worthwhile doing. And we've had it now for 3 years.
Then like half the grade units at the end.
5 and 6 for the first lot, and then last year was 3s and 4s. And Key Stage 2 you've always had it in Key Stage 3.
Yeah.
You won't be there, this is what they won't be there as well.
Right, I will leave you to it.
Yeah, come on. You got another meeting to go to. Come on.
Okay. Well, good. Let's start then, yeah? Okay, so afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to try and... this is Let's Think in English, and I wrote the programme with my colleague Laurie at King's College London. And basically, what I'm going to try and do, briefly, succinctly as possible, because I know it's Monday, everybody's probably a bit weary, is to just give you some of the research and pedagogy behind it, so that when you go in to watch it, or when you start to teach, you have some idea of what it is and why we do it. So we're going to mainly focus on that for about half an hour. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about maybe some of the teaching behaviourisms that you might see when you watch somebody else do it. But hopefully the main thing will be to just discuss it with people who do it and get a sense for what's going on. So the first thing, just if ever you're interested enough, I don't know if you will, some people become interested in the programme, interested enough to want to look at the research. It's got 2 names. So we rebranded it because the original programme is called Cognitive Acceleration. It's kind of a really ugly name because 2 scientists thought of it. It's like brainwashing with electrodes. But really, Let's Think is what we try and do. We try to help pupils and students become more thoughtful and more reasonable, more evident in their reasoning. That's what we think. Because we think if they can do that, they'll become better at all their subjects. And I'll show you the evidence behind that as we go through the talk. Now, Monday after school, a bit of Vygotsky always goes down well. But I'll start with Vygotsky. So this is really the underpinnings, is Vygotsky and Piaget. It's what the whole program is based upon. And I call it the litmus test, because I think you know really quickly if you're going to like the program or not based on this, because this is what we base it on. So for ease of purpose, 4 bullet points from Vygotsky. It's always an embarrassment to do this in somebody's canon of work, but it sums it up quite neatly. So the 4 things we argue is that pupils and students and teenagers, they should socially construct their understanding. They need to work together to understand the things they're studying. In Let's Think in English, the aspects of the programme I lead is obviously about reading text, and we think it's really important to get opportunity to develop their understanding of themselves. I don't know, I'm sure it's not the case here, but in the UK there's a big movement towards telling children about stories before you even read them. I couldn't think of anything worse. Can you imagine somebody sitting with you and sort of telling you the whole story, they're fusing it, and then saying, would you like to read the text? And you tend to say no. You've ruined it for them. The other point, of course, is that whether you're working with year 3 or year 9, they understand the text very differently to what we do. And you have to hear them to understand their reasoning. We try and apply our adult reasoning to the way they're going to read things. Often you mistake it, they have misunderstandings you can't conceive. They have ways of answering the questions we pose around the text you can't possibly imagine as an adult, because it's right for where they are. And what we try and do is take where they are and then make it more reasonable. So what that means in the classroom is they work in small groups. Some of you have seen some of the lessons today. We put them into small groups. Normally, if it's my class, I put them into groups of 3. We can put them into 4s, 5s, 6s. There's no consensus on that. We put them into groups where they can share their ideas and build their own understanding. Is that okay? So that's the first one. Okay, second one is really important. So Vygotsky talks about the relationship between thought and language, and he would argue that many of your pupils and students will not understand their inner thoughts if you give words to them. So their thinking is half formed until the time they actually give words to their thoughts. They need time to form. We say this all the time, is that when the pupils speak, their first audience is themselves. It's often one of the first times they start to understand their own logic. And because of that, you'll see 2 things that happen fairly frequently in classrooms. I'm sure you've all come across this, that when somebody puts their hand up, like the rocket hands, so they're really excited because they know the answer or they want to explain something. Oh, they're almost, jumping out of their seat. You say, okay, tell me, what do you think? But in the act of answering it, they stop themselves. So literally, they say, I think it is da-da-da-da, and half the go, oh, actually, I don't know, or I'm not sure, do you ask something else? I mean, if you talk, you all come across that, yeah? It's very common. Why we'd argue to do that is because they're hearing their logic out loud. Does that make sense? They're hearing their arguments, and as they hear it, they start to realise, actually, there's something wrong. They realise it, but internally it sounds okay. You get the opposite, you know, like the kind of breathless dogs, that as they're answering, they gather momentum, and they, in the moment, start to add more and more detail. Say, oh no, I've realised, oh, another thing, oh, you know, like almost like little epiphanies. Again, because they're hearing the logic of their first strand of argument, they can then build on the second one. The lessons, if you've seen them or so them, they're totally oral, talk-based. We found, we think writing actually slows down their cognition. If introduced too early, it's a barrier. They start to get really worried about the grammar, spelling, what book to put it in. Their processing is taken up with that, whereas the talk is so fluid, you can shift positions, adopt somebody else's when they go through. So the second one is we give them very long, extended periods of talk, which has its challenges. So we're not saying it's all going to be fine. Challenges in it. I was teaching year 3 just after lunch, and they did really well for about 50 minutes, and then just dropping like flies really around, because it demands a lot of them. It's very, very taxing lesson. Okay, does that make sense? Second one. Okay, third was equally important. I guess at extremes in education, you could say there's discovery learning, where you put stimulus out for pupils and students and they discover things, they play with them, work through. So like early years is a brilliant example of that normally, the way it works. And sometimes in teaching, you can a certain form of direct instruction where you've got to tell them things, they need to rehearse it, repeat it back to you, and they all have their merits. But ours is somewhere in between. It's not discovery, it's not facilitation, we call it mediation, is the term we use for it. Because what we do is we start with the pupil's logic, and then we use their logic to guide them into deeper understanding. That's the point. You start with where they are, you listen to where they are, and you guide them in, chiefly through questioning. So we do tell them bits and pieces, we clarify things for them, we question them into it. I'll talk to you about the research findings from that. The idea is that you nudge them in, you guide them in, you make them discover things, but you're all the time, the teacher, the point I want to emphasise to you is the teacher is in control of the lesson. Just like anything else, it's just the way you're controlling it might be different. If you've seen it, you might realise that, and it's this continual questioning, kind of building it all together. And then the final part is this, is where Piaget, who I'll come on to next, and Vygotsky both agrees, they argue all the time that for deep learning, and I'll show you the research behind LTiE, but for deep learning to happen, it has to be problematic. It's got to be, and this is, I think probably, when I look at teaching, it's the hard thing, isn't it really, is what's the right level of difficulty? Because you have so many variables in the classroom, so the right level of difficulty for one person is something different from another, but we think it's something about the collaboration of it. So we make it purposefully difficult, and it's worth remembering that. There's a real progression through the lessons where they're very accessible, they have low entry points and high ceilings, but as you build through it, it gets to the point where it gets harder and harder for them, because we don't think in the moment necessarily they'll reach all the answers, but long term, it'll stick more for them. Does that make some sort of sense? Right, give it a go. So things always work better when you give it a go. On your tables, you've got a copy of a text. There's some there, make sure you can see one. Everybody see one? Okay, so this, if secondary colleagues might, did you see this lesson already? Or?
Yeah, I taught this on Friday.
Oh, did you? Great, okay. So have a go, you're going to have a quick go at yourself as a student. How's it going Friday? Good? Yeah. It's a quite neat lesson. It's the first one we normally do with year 7s. So we're going to read it and you're going to undertake the task in 2 different ways and compare and contrast it. Okay, that's what we're going to do. It's going to be brief. The bridge. This happened in America during the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. People have talked about it ever since. The bridge. A woman lived with her husband in a town beside a river. One day, her husband went away for 3 months. While her husband's away, the woman took a lover who lived across the bridge on the other side of the river. One day, while she was with her lover, the woman heard that her husband was coming home. She left her lover and tried to cross the bridge. But now there was a soldier on the bridge. The soldier said, "Stop. I have orders that no one must cross the bridge. If you try to cross the bridge, I will shoot you." Near the bridge was a boat. The woman told the boatman she needed to cross the river. The boatman said he would take her across the river if she paid him $100. The woman didn't have $100, so she asked her lover to give her the money, but he refused. The woman tried to cross the bridge. The soldier shot her dead. Okay. We're going to do the same task but 2 different ways. Try and do it the way intended. First, by completely alone, without any consultation, I want you to rank the 5 characters in terms of who you think is most to blame to least to blame for the woman's death. Who do you think is the most to least? There's 5 of them: the husband, the woman, the lover, the soldier, the boatman. 1 to 5. And obviously have your own reasons. Everybody's going to go. So you can probably guess the way you're going to. So the second time around now, we're going to work on your tables. Don't fall out, it's very early in the week. Mondays, you've got a long time to teach other stuff. Now, 1 to 5, you've got to come to agreement as a group. Then you're going to share, discuss, evidence, your opinion. We're going to try and do it quite quickly because it's being said. But let's say 5 minutes, so 4 minutes to agree, 1 to 5. Off you go. Just join the group, just started to read a text and made some up to read a bit, listening to the discussion.
If he had not done it, he would have.
Should we agree that
It's not a right or not, but it's then the people who blame more than the soldiers. The soldiers is doing the sold legally for that group. He was just following
But he could be a man, he could be a man, he could be a man.
yeah, exactly. Who's the most responsible? So I sort of blame but the soldiers just follow you. Soldiers want to kill She really wanted you as a curious and going into it. You knew it was risk. You chose not to trust her.
Yeah, make sure, yeah.
Should we say
I don't think it's not a fault. I know. I could vote this.
$100 is $3,000. I did.
I was thinking about your reason. He's trying to do it for gratification.
try and get
So-
more details.
Are we assuming that both knows she's a
I would.
Yeah.
He knows.
But it's also, I don't want to leave it, I don't want to leave it.
She's just trying to get money.
Yeah.
True.
Okay,
so should we do-
No, wait, if I'm paying them stuff forever.
Should we do lover number?
Yeah, no, I do expect it. Sure you yeah.
Lover's number, yeah, lover.
Was that bypass number one?
Should we do lover number
I've got
4?
woman and lover at 1 and 2. I can't really decide who's
Yeah, and
supposed to
then-
play.
Yeah, because
And it's
But
like,
soldier
and I can't figure out if I
So we do.
put the lover, the woman,
Did the husband not
it's, as I said, it's kind of made all these choices
Say again.
that led to.
I couldn't skip it. Or this is your inferring thing between lines. Always happening. Subjunctive mood.
Well, I said number one, even though I said number one. Does anyone? I thought the
Yeah, but we can't say that.
I've got him at the bottom.
Yeah, even the other ones you see, like, go around, he's got, he
Lover.
take-
Lover number 4. I love how all of this is.
It's not.
Just trying to play
It's
case.
And then it comes at a point, we
And
drop
it's
the
the whole thing of
thing.
smuggling. But if he was, if he'd taken her, he was just shot.
That's true.
Either woman is number 1.
Well, yeah, I think,
Soldier's number
I think
2.
any of us
No,
are
that's-
going,
why
why
should
should
you
one
try
of
to
these
find
two thinking about it.
Yeah.
She's trying to cross the bridge to get her.
Oh, yeah, well aware of it. That is much lower than the.
Yeah, no, you do, you do get both.
what's this?
She wasn't trying to go home and be honest, she was trying to get back into Tell us the story of where this is coming from. What's the backstory to that? George is planning Should we agree on boatman number 3? Do you think, or soldier number 3, boatman number 2?
I think soldier's gone a lot. I understand the point.
True, but the boatman was just trying to take advantage.
It says he was the best.
He must
He was the person that shot him. He's a soldier, it's different though, it's not the same as like.
But you still make this choice for it.
Sure. Even if you've been given an
Also,
order, you can.
yeah, you're right.
That's
He
true.
should be in that role. He should be in that job.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you do
I've
everything?
got husbands with 3 of them, because I feel like.
He's being paid, he's being paid.
3 months.
How we getting on? All in agreement?
No.
Husband must be a shitty husband.
Surprising.
Also, we're kind of
If it's at 3
assuming.
months, you just feel like, all right, yeah, you know what, I can't handle it, I'm gonna go find something else. There must be something else going on.
Do I need it doesn't say. Yeah, they do say this. I'll bring it to you. It's just the start of the lesson. But they do something next with them.
I just can't.
They start to move down towards that change. They see it as a real game changer. It's whoever cheats first as a high play.
I don't know, maybe not.
How you doing?
Terrible, we haven't agreed on
It's fine, it's
anything.
not terrible, that's part of the process. Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do, because of the way of the time. We're going to stop, because it's really just for, I know you're probably keen, you carry on your own time, reconfigure your own teacher's Let's Think group, you know, maybe regular thing on a Monday if you see fit. I mainly did it just to try to illustrate the points. So you did it in 2 different ways. One way was alone, without consultation, reading, no guidance, and so on and so forth. And obviously the second way you were able to discuss it. Now, the second way it was here was more time consuming, but would you say it was helping to understand the text better? Yeah. And this is really at the heart of it. You've just done a very quick exercise, but what we'd argue is this one, social construction of understanding, you see the text differently. You see? We see it, we read it differently, and that's something rich to explore. The same with the kids. We did lessons today. You'll hear they've got different standpoints, and you don't try and get to reconcile it. It's the reconciliation of the points that brings the depth to them. Did you find? Did anybody go to the text to support their point? Did you get that far with your arguing? Yeah. Let's do it together quickly. So say if I'm sure, did anybody have the woman the most to blame? Yeah, it's fairly common. Yeah. So if you did, what would be a key word? If you were using it to argue, I mean, some evidence from the text and the woman's to blame, what would you say the key?
Responsibility?
Yeah.
Guilty?
Guilty. And in the text itself, what do you think? Any key words? Or
Took a lover.
Right, took a lover. So this is exactly what happens with the students. They have opposing points, but it forces them back to the text. And with a little bit of guidance, they'll say, well, it says the woman took a lover. So these big general arguments start to become hooked on the text. Say with the lover, what's a key word for the lover? Refused. Because it probably implies that he had the money but didn't give it. Yeah? So do you see, like, big general argument discussing, and then it brings you back to the text to resolve it. So you socially constructed it. Could you see that if we asked you to write down a paragraph explaining, which I didn't do, but you know, compared to, there's something about taught that's very fluid. So you can change position. That's what we found. We used to do it with the writing, and we found the kids would never ever alter their opinion. They sort of process driven, with the pens down, it's over done with. They're taught through, you say, go through. It's hard to know really where you get to where you are. So all the time sort of saying, yeah, it could be a little bit, and shifting sands. It enables them to take more risks. Can I ask you a question? Any of you feel slightly anxious about whether you had it right or wrong? No? Because sometimes teachers, there's a little bit of like, oh, you kind of check somebody else's. The kids often feel real worry about if they're right or wrong. But again, that gets reduced when it's talk-based. Because you can shift what people say, oh no, actually I think what they think. It's not the same as having to cross out your whole argument in the time you've invested in it. Makes sense again? So you can do it that way. In this instance, I didn't really give you much guidance because I made a judgment you get fine with it. But typically we would intervene. So as I explained, when it talks very general, I might say, okay, well now stop. If you think the woman's most to blame, find a bit of the text that's most important to argue that and negate everything. Same with the loving. We give guidance, but it's not necessary. And the point why it might be, you seem to get engaged for a little while with that, maybe because it's problematic. I mean, if I said to you, underline the 5 characters or find the 5 verbs that are important, whatever the case may be, it's not engaging in the same way, but the problem part means that you're engaging it. We do this introduction quite a lot of kids, and 2 members of staff come from each school to the opening, and it stays with them. They just carry on arguing over lunch. We often have to intervene, so they go home in peace. Say, I never knew you thought about women that way, and it goes backwards and forwards. But because it's problematic, the same with the kids. I would argue, and it's only for your own experience to judge this on, but frequently they still want to discuss the lessons when at the end of them. There's something long-lasting about it that keeps them thinking and going on. Okay, so does that make a bit of sense? Does that seem a reasonable proposition? This is what we're basing it upon. Now, a bit more tricky. I'm not going to go into Piaget. You'll be glad to know at 3:20 on a Monday. We've got a very, very brief guidelines, but it's important because the aim of the programme is cognitive development. You've got to remember this. It's the aim of it. You're going to try to help them with their cognition. And there's lots of interesting data on that and why they might need assistance. Basically, Piaget has this model of cognitive development, which I'm sure you remember from PhD, Master, so on and so forth, where they go from sensor motor to pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operations. This is largely irrelevant to you. I mean, the age you teach is very unusual as a child's got extreme special needs. But you, depending on which age group you teach, your pupils should be pre-operational, concrete operational, or formal operations. I'll give you a very brief description of the stages, and then think to yourself, do you recognise any of your pupils in it? Pre-operational would be very egocentric type thinking and talk. The whole problem is about them. It's not relating it to your life and making sense of it, it becomes about you. At pre-operational, you tend to display centricism, which is getting fixated on one aspect of a problem. Have you ever taught pupils who code in on one little detail of text and can't shift beyond it? Or kids, when you set them any sort of problem, get fixated on one bit of it and won't step back? That is a pre-operational stage. At pre-operational stage, they struggle to take perspectives. They can only see things from their own point of view. They find it hard to think it could be like that. Alternatives. Pre-operational, they struggle to reverse their thinking. So once they think one way, they can't show the fluidity of going back the other way. Now, Piaget would say that happens up to 7 years of age, and it's not something to get concerned about. I mean, if you teach, don't be, oh my God. It's kind of, natural, it's a natural stage. However, who teaches year 5, 6, or has done 7, 8, 9 over here? Have you ever had students who've shown some of these characteristics? Of course you have. This is the thing. The problem with Piaget's model is he says, look, it's okay, it happens up to 7, it stops. Then you go to there, then go there. That doesn't happen. That's the problem, it doesn't happen. We watch GCSE classes and you'll see the problem is not, I mean this, it's not a problem with English. It's a cognitive problem. Yeah, they get stuck at cognitive stage of development. They haven't moved through the stages. It's okay, stage 1. Stage 2, 7 to 12, concrete operational. Normally around sort of middle stage of year 3, we're teaching today, they start to move towards this. It means they just make logical reasons for their thoughts. They can logically explain it when they go through. Yeah? They start to have a logic to their arguments when they go through. It's what you're seeking in point evidence explanation. It's logic behind it. Lucky secondary teachers, 11 to 13, they can all think in the abstract. There we go, done and dusted. So there you go, they can generalise beyond the moment, they can link it wider, they can think about things, they see fiction as a kind of construct rather than something that's just there, so on and so forth, happens there. Again, it doesn't just happen there, and it can happen here. So actually, who was watching lessons today? A couple of you watching this. You would see the younger kids were doing bits of this at times. Yeah, the girl is trapped in the tower. They're talking about the symbolism of colour, why it's not there. But in the classroom, most of them were there today. They're just on the cusp between it. Our programme is trying to get them to move through at an appropriate pace. At an appropriate pace. If you try and get them to here, it will totally break down. Yeah, just trying to get them to move step by step. Is that okay? Some sense, right? Okay, good. Now I decided that we normally then hit you really hard with loads of impact evidence. I'm not going to do that. It's all online. The interesting thing about the impact, they did a research in UK extensively, then America, China, Singapore. Let's Think program. The patterns are these. Significant impact, but delayed impact. So this is really important. You don't get quick wins from the programme. There is no quick win. Developing cognition takes time, and as teachers, it takes a little bit of time to get used to it. That's part of it. It's slow and drips down. The pivotal study they did was with CASE, where they trained 10 schools in CASE and then 10 control schools, and they did something which no school did before. They taught them lessons in just year 7 and 8, no further intervention. They said, what happens 3 years later? And if you've been teaching any length of time, you know lots of things wash away. Yeah, they're kind of good for a little while, wash away. What happened was 3 years later, with the control schools and CASE schools, the CASE schools outperformed the control schools by 25% in science, maths, and English, or they just did science. It was unheard of, utterly unheard of. Nothing before or after has been comparable, because they developed the ability to. You have to do your thinking in a subject, but then there's something you can transfer across once it gets strong. If you're interested, all the links are online, and we've go on for a long time. Right, now let's think in English. We're going to look at just one piece of research, the biggest one we got today. In the UK, you may have heard of this chap, Boris Johnson. Ever heard of this guy? It's in the news a little bit at the moment. But he was the mayor of London at the time, and he encouraged grand excellence in education in London by providing funding just before he was going to be re-elected mayor of London. You could bid for it. So we did, and we trained 42 secondary schools and 15 primaries. I've just got the primary data up, so I thought most of you be primary, but it's very similar to secondary. They did a test, GL reading assessment test, which I think you might do here. And what happened was we did control classes. So we trained to teach the school, and all the other classes would be control classes. They sat the test initially, answered it. At the end of it, the LTiE classes outperformed the non-LTiE classes by an additional 2.45. They almost made an additional year's reading progress after they did the program. But here is the most interesting bit, yeah? Because there's variables around that. It's a good research trend. It's not an absolute, because we didn't have control schools with control classes. And you could argue, well, you got the better teachers. You could argue, which was true, the teacher did program, grew to love it, and invested more in it, more in the test, and there's lots of facts. But here's the thing that probably should interest you most, is when both the control and non-control classes sat the test initially, we get the papers afterwards. Their attempts at the questions were around 85%. They answered 85 to 90% of the questions. it was really low stakes because the teachers who weren't doing the programme couldn't wait to get the test done. Can you imagine, like, you've got to do it, but why? You're not even doing the programme, but you need the data. And the teachers who were doing the programme hadn't started, so they didn't care either. So everybody sat these tests for 20 minutes or so and said, look, just get it done, go in. But if they didn't know something, the majority of kids, about 85% wouldn't answer it. But the second time around, the LTiE classes answered about 95%, and the control group stayed at 85 to 90, because the one thing we train them all the time into is, why do you think that? Tell me more. Is continue building their efficacy. We put them on them all the time. Tell me a bit more. Explain that to me. Dylan Williams, who you might know, great researcher at King's, talks about a case and says he thinks it's that. It's about building their willingness to give things a go. We put it on them all the time. I think it's, tell me why. It's that simple. Explain a bit more. What do they say? Okay, these are the key bits you're going to need to know if you're going to teach them. This is the structure of the lesson. It always follows this structure. I'll briefly explain it to you, but you'll need to look at this in the lesson plans when you come to them. I suggest talk to somebody who's already taught the lessons and have a little bit of a think through them. They follow this pattern every single time. We start with a concrete preparation, which means making it real in their world. We would typically give them a little bit of text. So this was the concrete preparation which is done, the lesson. Read a little bit of text, make a general understanding of it. We give them maybe the title, the picture, front cover. Some of you saw today there's a front cover. We make some speculations on it. We give them any vocabulary. There will be a barrier. We clarify the task. But the most important bit we would say to our tutors is you have to hear them at the start of the lesson to understand what they know. And you know this is well established. It's not our work. It's well established cognitive science is that you can only build new knowledge on prior knowledge. You have to activate the prior knowledge. So you have to see what's there and awaken it to build new stuff on. So quick starter, as you normally have, but the idea is to hear them, listen to them, see where they are. Then we give them a construction. So the next stage of the bridge is actually to have more empathy for the woman and try to understand why she does what she does. That's the next stage for them, to think about the context of the story, so on and so forth. What the key words here is understanding. We try to make sure they understand the text. It's an important thing to say. You can't think deeply about things you don't understand. Yeah? You know, have you ever been in a company with somebody who's an expert in a certain field, and if you're a novice in this field, you can't suddenly start to think about that in a deep way because you don't know enough. So with the text, you have to make sure they understand it first, they get it. Deal with any misconception they have, so make sure they understand it. But then we set them a conflict, like a problem, something that's going to require them to think anew. It's hard, that bit, it's hard. It's like, you've got to this point, you understand it. Now how about this? The point about that stage, you must remember this when you're teaching it, is we pitch it just above where that year group would typically be. So if you set the questions individually to them, they would struggle to answer them. But we think in the groups and with your guidance, they should make a movement towards answering it. It will save you a lot of frustration if you understand that, because not every student in every lesson will answer it in a really clear, succinct way. If they could do that, in our opinion, it wouldn't be challenging enough. They're going to need time to progress. It's all about loops of learning over and over again, from year 2 to year 8, year 9. They're doing, I'll show you, they're doing the same type of reasoning over and over again. So for your own sake, just don't get too frustrated. You will get some drop off. It pulls it away. We end the lesson a little bit of a plenary, but we mainly focus on metacognition. I'm going to talk about that extensively tomorrow night. It's about duplication. The metacognition is just a review of how they're learning and evaluation. So it's not just what have you learned today, it's how have you learned, what would you do with it tomorrow. Yeah? It's equally important. And then finally, again, I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, they do bridging. This happens after the lesson is you have to make the learning relevant for them. You have to make it relevant. It will help, we've spoken about this in our meetings, but it helps when you map them into your curriculum, because they have more prior knowledge, they can sort of see the application of it. But you must call upon what they've done in the lesson outside the LTiE lesson to activate again, to make it work. So, you know, as simple as the bridge, you might talk to them, you know, in another text, how do we know who's to blame here, or how do you make a choice between the characters? How do you find evidence, you know, stuff like that, but you have to do it. Okay, one more bit, and then we're going to do another short task for free. We would argue I'll send the papers on this if you need them, because it's a bit more detailed. They argue that one way to become an expert reader is if you can develop these 5 types of reasoning with your pupils and students. And we do them on a loop. They do them in year 1 in the UK, all the way up to GCSE in the UK, schools that do the programme, of which there's about 600 now who do the programme, okay, primary, secondary. It's quite extensive. They do them in a loop. And my argument to you is this is what makes for really good readers. Beyond the actual ability to read, you know, that's a completely different skill set, which I have no expertise in. I'll leave all that to you. But once they can understand, decode, then this will be it. I'll give you an example of each one, and you're going to try it out for yourself, okay? So one thing we get into is classifying text. Classifying text. The question is, what is it I'm looking at? We get to classify fiction stroke non-fiction. How do you know what's there? We get to classify genre. So what makes horror horrific? What makes comedy funny? How can you blend them together? We get into classify character types. What do you expect of a hero? What do you expect of a villain? Does it change during the course of time? Different eras they go through. Classification. It's basically build up a classification system. What is it? And then you apply it. So for example, you might start a list by saying, what do you expect of ghost stories? They make their list. You'd read a ghost story. They see which ones the classifications was drawn upon. They see what's missing. They consider then how the writer used that genre, what he confirmed, what he denied. Is that okay? Okay, so what is it? Second one, frames of reference, has a couple of different aspects to it. Frames of reference is the relationship between any 2 sources. So particularly at primary, it's all about how the text and the images marry together and how they make meaning. So they don't make meaning alone, they make meaning together. And it's also context. So it's how does context change our reading of the text. We do a lot of that as they move up to school. So they may, tomorrow I'm going to be teaching a year 5 lesson on Langston Hughes, and we've got a level 1 for Key Stage 3, where they read a poem and try to understand what it's about, and then we give them some context. They have to reframe their reading, if that makes sense. You change your reading based on when you know what lies behind it. Yeah? Third one, consequences and intentions, is how do I feel about the text? Why do I feel that way? It's a tracking exercise. So when they're young, year 3, they talk about the characters. How do I feel about the character? Why do I feel that way? But as they move forward, they start to think about how the writer is manipulating us into that feeling. You all know texts and films and TV programs where on paper there's despicable characters, but you really like them. Yeah? They're common. And we're manipulated through loads of subtle nudges and hints of sometimes making the good characters so bland makes us like the bad characters. Sometimes about perspective, sometimes about empathy, but you're just always manipulated. We're trying to help pupils and students understand how. Fourth one causes them massive, massive problems, which is in a text, sometimes things are literal, and then sometimes become metaphorical or symbolic. And the majority of young children cannot understand the markers for the shift. They have to do something, they have to reread stories and create a new story to account for the fact it's in there. It's the only way they can deal with it. So you have to help them to understand when things are moving towards it. Try and help them to understand when something becomes symbolic. And we also got to be wary of kids who see symbolism everywhere. You know, that happens too. It's like everywhere. The head of English was explaining to me that after doing lots of LTiE, she's reading a non-fiction text where a woman was dressed in black coming onto a double-decker bus. It was a 70s text, non-fiction text. He said all she could hear, top set, chiming around the room, deaf, deaf, deaf. Like, no, sometimes people wear black. You need to find bigger clues than that. But you see, it's kind of making them understand it. And final one is sequencing, so the ordering of text. If some people saw it today, we did a year 3 lesson where we paused the text and they had to make a logical deduction of the pictures, like, you know, what order should they go in. As they move up to school, it's about narrative perspective, flashbacks, fast forwards, where do you start the story, where do you end, all the structural devices behind it. Okay, give it a go. I'm going to put a text up I don't think you've seen before. I want you to try, do it together. Try these things out. We need to do 5 things. First one, classify it. What type of text do you think it is? Yeah? What type of text? Fiction, non-fiction? If you go a bit further and say, you know, a genre type, fine. But first one. Frames of reference. What does it remind you of for now? That's really important. Explain that to you in a moment. what does it remind you of? And don't be too highbrow, anything goes. Yeah? So, you know, anything reminds you of, share it. Third one, what's the writer's intention at the text stage of the text you're in? Fourth one, is there anything more than literal, or is there anything potentially that could be more than literal about the text? And the last one is, what stage of the text do you think you're in? Beginning, middle, or an end? Does that make sense? Yeah? Just give it a quick go. Okay, here's the text, have a read, and then have a talk at your table or in pairs, and try and do the 5 types of reading. Okay, over to you. So what type of text is it? What does it remind you of? What's the intention? The stage you're in? Is anything more than literal? Anything potentially symbolic? Okay, have a talk.
Fiction. Probably push it down from the fable. Any of those fables and like myths, like creation stories and things.
Yeah. So that's almost going back to a stage to where you might expect it to be, because that's what we normally
Could also say that's the story
by
itself.
feeling rather than genre.
You have animals, you live there, public content, stories like
It's not very good for that, sorry.
Rags to riches.
yeah, children's book with pictures on each side. Appearing in the
I would say because it's not sticking with them. It's a moment really gets we get with your time doing primary school. So there's some young situation runs the pains and teaching.
Everyone's fine as long as they stay in their place.
you don't stop yourself for your room.
Yeah, exactly. That book was what's the trees and
Yes, they've gone back to, that's exactly a classification of like the luminous and like, is it happy or sad? Rather than time. Like by 3 and 4, so you start to identify time. Before, certainly, you should do that, so there's something, yeah, a little bit of work maybe to be done. Okay. Is everybody to go? Okay, so let's try and build it together quite quickly. Right, what does it remind anybody of? Bambi, yeah, so Disney, something Disney-like perhaps. Anything else?
Creation stories and myths.
Okay, creation stories and myths. Fables, yeah? So what we will be doing with the class, we're not going to do it with you, because the time is the big question of time is, why do you think that? Yeah, so they will feel something about it, they're going to justify it. Can you guess it's actually a type of text that this reminds them a lot of, that you haven't mentioned yet?
Horror, murder.
A little bit, yeah. Fairy tales is the one lots and lots of year 5 and 6 say. And it's fine, it's not a fairy tale. This is an interesting point about LTiE, is that doesn't matter, it's about the evidencing. So you would argue it could be a fairy tale. Why? Because it's by woods. Woods are often settings and problems happen there. Why? Because there's animals, and often you'll see more animals in there. So to see the point, as long as you can give the reasoning behind it and strengthen that, it's okay. Now, if you were thinking about like Bambi, Snow White, maybe some kids' books, Keep Animals of Farming Wood, When the Willows Live They Are, we'd say they're your frames of reference. And we think when you read, your mind plays a game of snap. You know the card game like, because what it does like, unlike, unlike, unlike. You don't consciously slow it down, but it does it instinctively. You're recalling the ones that it recognises, like a pattern. And this is what reasoning is, defined as seeing patterns in new information. And so what we're going to try and help the students and pupils do, see patterns between texts. Why is that one like another one? The problem is, and maybe less of a problem in your school, but certainly in our school, is that the kids' pack of cards can be really variable in terms of size. So you cannot, for example, see their creation stories if you've never read creation stories. It makes sense, you know, it's impossible. You can't suggest it's an allegory if you've never read them before. So part of LTiE is trying to build that pack of cards with them and the patterning at the same time. Okay, fiction or non-fiction? Yeah, because key things. Past tense. And
animals, probably human-esque.
And sharing, maybe the one as well, yeah. And the last line, they were content with being common ones. So when you ask, this is one of our year 5, 6 lessons. We don't ask them all the things we're asking you. But typically, in a class, you'll have kids who will think it's non-fiction. Why? Because it lists animals. Yeah. To the other extreme, where kids will say it's going to be one of those stories where the animals speak immediately. You'll see it in complete pattern, and it will have a moral to say to you within just reading that. So you've got this massive gulf in terms of the recognition of the expectancy of what's, you know, how they're set up. They need to see the patterns better when they go through it. Okay, what stage of the text are we in? Beginning, yeah, probably, doesn't it? See, because you choose characters, you choose settings. Sometimes the kids say you have the same start and end point. That might work. It seems like to be the beginning. And it could there be anything symbolic about it? Yeah, okay. Yeah. You're one of those, are you? Yeah, when you go on the bus and they're like, yeah, it's there. But yeah, it's got a lot, hasn't it? I mean, what about the cool brown water? Seems odd, doesn't it? Something so idyllic. That's there. The forest. Why is there a clearing? We don't know. It could be, the point is at this point, it could be just literal, or it could be symbolic. But you're open to possibility. For some kids, this is literally something completely literal. On the other hand, you've got someone already suggesting it's a moral. Now, it's actually an allegory of the Holocaust. It's the opening of a book, a picture book that we get to study year 5, 6. It's an allegory of the Holocaust. The next line, what do you think happens in the next line? What would you expect in a story? What would happen next? Problem, exactly. Again, if you take year 5, 6, normal class, some of them can get that and understand narrative sequencing perfectly. Some of them don't understand that yet. They don't see the kind of patterns that should be there. And this is what we're going to train them into. You've done all 5 of them in one quick go, but what we do is we take one of them at a time. The bridge is frames of reference, and we slow it down. We get to really train them through it at an age-appropriate rate. It should mean that when they see new text, they start to see patterns quicker and they recognise there are ways of writing text. There's kind of structures to it. They need to recognise the norm to recognise how writers do it differently. Does that make some sense? It's quite a quick race through, but it's what we do. Right, now, why is that important? Why do it the way we do it, okay? In the UK at the moment, there's a big push about this. Have you ever heard this, any of you, about this 30 million word gap? They argue that when children start school, some kids have been exposed to 30 million words more than other kids. And the answer, they would argue sometimes, is to teach discrete vocabulary to make it up. They say that would be a bit of a problem to do. And some traditional studies of vocabulary would argue that. There's merits to that. But if you look at this more recent research, Romeo and Gabriel, what they did is put MRI, they gave little recorders to children who walk around before they start school and recorded their vocabulary to change, because normally what it's argued is that kids who know lots of words come from affluent backgrounds, kids who don't know many words are normally from poor backgrounds. That's seen as a socio-economic factor. But a study blew that out of the water, because they realised it wasn't the number of words the kids are exposed to that makes a difference. In a sense, an adult can talk to their blue in the face, and children won't necessarily take it on the vocabulary. There was something called turn taking. He said when it's turn taking, the vocabulary sticks. It didn't matter about the wealth of the parents. It didn't matter. It mattered whether or not it turns. In fact, sometimes you can imagine some upper middle class households, it was negative because they're trying to train them into learning vocabulary, like Tabitha, remember for me, which was inappropriate for them. They couldn't handle it. It got washed away because vocabulary has to be context. And turn taking develops cognition. What they really meant was posing questions, pausing, letting children completely finish their train of thoughts, exposing them to another train of thought. It's what we do in LTiE. Yeah? It's one long, extended period of turn taking. In little groups, they take turns. They turns across groups. As a teacher, you take turns with them, and they develop it because it's making them think. Yeah? It makes them think. Is it about a young child at home? Or ever had a young child? I mean, you know, sometimes it's painful having to experience it. Sometimes you don't want to ask the question. Sometimes you don't want to answer the question. But the long, extended exercise in explaining it is them getting their thoughts clear, and they have to do it that way. Right, last one, and we're going to stop. Just tell you a little bit about teaching and learning, then any questions. Okay, another study, you know, all these places do them, they're interesting in their own rights. Institute of Education did a study which took an awful lot of data around why were some children more successful at school than others. It started off as a medical basis, and then they chunked it up and looked at it. And they found this. They said children who are read regularly to by their parents at up to age 5 perform better than any other groups at 16 years of age. It's the most helpful thing they could do. It outperformed level of household income, it outperformed level of education of parents, it outperformed even family units. It was how frequently they were read to between 0, well, you know what I mean, but 0, quite soon at birth, 5 years of age. Now again, what happens in LTiE is we would argue that what happens between 1 and 5 years of age is without unwittingly, please don't do that. I did a talk once in Hong Kong, and people came up to me and said, okay, I've got a 2-year-old, which one should I start with? It's like, you'll end them, they never want to read it. Don't do that. You do it intuitively, okay? This is the point, they need explicit teaching later on. But you do it for them. Think about, hands up if you've read to a child between 1 and 5 years of age. Okay, so everybody has pretty much, okay? You normally cannot read it in a straight way. That makes sense, okay? Can't just open a page and go through and read it one after the other. You normally, okay, if it's not Friday night and you want your glass of wine, you normally will adopt voices, you will monitor them for their understanding, confusion, you will pause, ask them questions, you'll pick up on their feelings. Oh, this is making you scared. It seems, yeah? Does that sound familiar? Yet you've given them a dialogic, guided reading of the text, okay? And by doing that, you'll classify. Is that a happy or sad story? Did you like that story or not like that story? That's a classification. Yeah? You're building a framework to decide that. Frames of reference. Oh look, Percy the Park Keeper's doing something different this story to the last one. Yeah? It's that basic, but it's there. It's a frame of reference. We do loads of this when they're little. Did you like it? How did it make you feel? We monitor that them and we drop it a bit too soon, I think. We do a bit of symbolism. Do it to I've got older children, I've got a 3-year-old, and we're reading a book. He said to me, 3-year-old, look at the blue in the trees because he misses the wolf. They'll pick up, you know, odd little things in text. The weather changing. You might say to them, why we're doing this today with year 3's the video, and it goes grey. And it took them a while, and then one of them said, it's because the woman's sad, and the colour's reflecting it. You'll do it then. And you do sequencing. Did you like the ending? Is it good? Ending? Well, this is a good start. Should we read a bit more? It's dialogic. We think they've been asked quite often to read alone too early. They should be reading alone, but lots of them need the scaffolded reading, if that makes sense. Collaborative reading together, sharing, low risk for them of sharing ideas. We've got ideas like that, and your guidance. And that's really the heart of what we do. Is that okay? Yeah? Right, I'm going to 4 more minutes, and I'm not even going to use the PowerPoint. I'm going to tell you a couple of the key points about the teaching and learning, the things that we found that were powerful. So, get some of the controversial things out of the way first. We don't use any praise in our lesson. It's completely neutral, which might be hard to understand until you see the lesson. But can anybody guess, like, why don't we praise the responses?
It's kind of leading them to kind of closed thoughts.
Yeah. So we found this really early on that they seek teachers' affirmation. That's what they want. They want you to say something that's right or wrong. There's a place for that. Yeah, it's going to be hard. Don't just say, yeah, don't worry, it's a bit daunting, you'll be okay.
Actually, it's not.
Yeah, once you get used to it, it's okay.
Once you've got the sort of, the stop phrase.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's, it's not.
It's not too bad.
And don't worry if you go, ooh, that's
Yeah.
Don't go, ooh.
Would you say that should be done in all lessons?
No, I'm not. Just an art. Yeah, no. I think that would be. There is. I say it's every school I work with. There's a really interesting study to be done around use of praise in classrooms. There's a fascinating paper by Sutton Trust who talk about how much empty praise is used in classrooms, how it becomes redundant because it's been overused for things that aren't praiseworthy. But just for ours, we make it neutral. It's warm, thank you. A lot of it is what do you think about what they're saying. But what we found is if you give affirmation to it, they drop the alternatives, and also they don't get the depth to their point because it's easy. I'm right. Mr. Sir thinks that, and it's easier. We want to develop the reasoning to make it neutral. They have to do the work through it. We also do a lot of work on them evaluating each other's responses. Really, is how it should work.
They think that that kid's got the right answer. If you said, yeah, that's great.
When we used to do the really early research, we would teach the lessons on the loop ourselves and record them. We had a big group of teachers who would teach them as well. And for argument's sake, we would normally be sat in the back table out of the way and find a little space for us to get rid of us back there where they taught the lessons. So we could listen to the group here really close and be recording it, and we'd have the recordings of all the groups. And what's happened is the teacher would say, and they do say quite incredible things in the lessons because the way they're set up. They would say something remarkable, you go, oh, that's brilliant. And then they go, okay, what do you think back there? And they would say, we think what they think. They drop their idea because it's safer for them, safer to do it. So neutrality is a really, really important one for it. You have to tell them this though. Don't make mistakes. You must explain to them, I'm not using praise, otherwise they'll speculate there's something wrong with you. Like you had a bad meal last night, or the cat's not well. You tell them, you just be open, look, it's this kind of lesson, I'm not going to, I'm used to praising, but I'm not going to do it this time, it's going to be neutral. Another one is, when they're in groups, we let them work in groups, we don't sit in the group, is a big one. So when we do lots of our projects, initially teachers with best will in the world sit in with a group and kind of guide it without realising it, because they pump you for information once you're in with them. But the bigger problem really is that you don't know where the other groups are. And the big challenge of it is to listen to them, because you have to try and map their feedback. So we all the time try and map where the different groups are. So we start with the lowest order point, if that makes sense, and then we kind of scaffold it up group by group. It's not an exact science, so don't beat yourself up. But it's the idea, when I was teaching, I'd always have like a really set way of taking my feedback. It'd be A, B, C, D, E. And then on Fridays I go E, D, C, B, A, because I was getting D-mob happy. But it wasn't the best because I hadn't thought through that the order that you collect responses in can have a big impact, because kids don't benefit from hearing the highest order point first. They just assume it again. They benefit from hearing an idea just ahead of them a lot more. They can step into it, they go in, and they go through. The other one, just one slide, 2 slides only, and I'm going to stop. Any questions, answers, and we'll stop for the day. This one is important. It's just to reassure you of why this might be a bit different for you and them when you start it. Okay.
Duplicate.
Is that camera volume sensed or?
Yeah, no, just track. It's because it is.
It's got a tracker.
Yeah. It follows you everywhere.
Okay.
But,
Does it still keep going?
so press enter.
Double click it.
There we go. Right.
Is that on your? Is it on your?
My membership.
Okay. Is it? It's just. Because you're not seeing this. Not seeing it. Is it this one?
No, keep going. No. Okay, next one. Right, this is, I think, when you're starting it, this is the most interesting 2 slides to look at and to consider. I mean, all of this will be in a shared area somewhere, and you've got colleagues who've been doing it for a while to talk to them. But the main mode of address in the classroom, then recognise it's initiation, response and feedback. That's what mostly happens, which is basically teacher poses a question, individual pupil student answers, and then the teacher gives feedback on the point. So it would look like, what is a simile, a phrase that you like as, a teacher says, yes, that's right, or not quite, or almost. You know, it's a regular pattern, isn't it? Serve the question, get it back. There's merits to that, but in LTiE it looks quite different. So I'll leave you with this slide. It looks like this, okay? And it's completely different to manage it in this way. So you're a bit like the start of this one. Who do you think is to blame for what happens to the woman? You pose a question, yeah? But what happens is, rather than one student getting a response and one student gets feedback, once you get them working effectively in their groups, and there's lots, getting to work effectively in their group, you don't just put them into groups. There's really clear research that you have to do things which, you know, colleagues you're working with can explain to you. It'd be too much today, but it's things you have to put mechanisms in place for effective group work. But once you got it in place, they get responsive feedback, all of them, in their groups. That makes sense. I think it's a woman. You're wrong. No, I'm not. I'm right. It's feedback. It's not the type you are. And then they start, you know, well, I think it's a soldier. Why? Because he's the one that shot her. Yeah, but if she had tried to cross the bridge, yeah, makes sense. But in their little groups, they're getting this ritual once you get them working place. Then what happens is, and this takes longer, is that once they've done it in their groups, as a teacher, you then try to assimilate it together. So what they do to start with, they talk directly to you. They'll say, well, you know, I think. We could train them into we think to summarise rather than the I think. So if you see the lesson, you see how we do it. But it's always we. No good working in a group for a minute and then say, well, I think what I thought 60 seconds ago, which a lot of them will do, to train into we think. But once they start to do the group feedback, we try and help them to sort of feed it across each other. Yeah, you know, do you agree with it? Do you want to build on? Do you want to challenge? So on and so forth. And here's the point: is that they settle somewhere. Yeah, they're the age they are. You'll know more about the text than they do, nearly always. And you know what you want for them to get from the text, rather than sometimes where they're going to go with it. Okay. So what happens is, based on their response and feedback, you then initiate again. And initiation is just posing another question, or say, can you find me more evidence for that? Or saying to them, some people would think something different. Sometimes they struggle to see a possibility. Say to them, in the class I taught last year, they always argue. Give them the premise, they have to do the reasoning. The reasoning bit's important to go through. And they start again. Dylan talks about it, Williams talks about the difference between, like, you know, table tennis, where you're serving, sometimes back, to basketball. So LTiE is not a bad sort of way of putting it. Is they get the ball, they get this problem, they pass it between themselves, and then they shoot for the hoop. And then, what, like any other lesson, what you do is, if they miss by a long, long way, you support them a bit more, you guide them in a bit more. If they get it in straight away, you push the question up, make it hard for them. So just remember that is probably quite different, we find, to the way the majority of teachers teach. Not to say you don't do bits of that, I'm sure you do, but to consistently do that for an hour, just talk, so forth, is different. We haven't been to school. We're working at the moment with Winchester School, School 21 in Hackney, that's all about oracy, and even there they don't tend to do the whole hour. Yeah, it says, you know, you can tell there's going to be challenges. Go through, but take it easy and stamina. Does it give you a kind of a starting point? Yeah. Any questions? So you look around, if you're really killing it, ask a question this time. If you don't, just go and have a go at it. Yeah, teach a couple, have a good time with them, talk to people doing them, and everything will be fine. But hopefully, having a little bit, whatever you take from this in your mind will help you to understand why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah. Okay, nice to see you all. Have a nice Monday evening. Okay, you're right.
Thanks, Michael. I'll share these PowerPoints with you guys, so you've got some sort of reference there. And like Michael said, go and have a go with these lessons and be a part of it. And also, one thing I would say is go and observe teachers who've been doing it for a few years now. The 5th and 6th teachers, people like don't think they've been doing it for say a while, since we've got that in place. But you know, peer observation is absolutely fantastic in terms of learning.